It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's presentation by Dr. Lindsey Fitzharris. I want to especially acknowledge many of Lindsey's personal fans who are with us tonight. She has a very enthusiastic following, and Halloween is an especially appropriate time of year for them. Many people have worked to make this evening possible, but I would be particularly remiss if I did not begin by acknowledging two people who deserve special thanks. Professor Mike Weiss, chair of our history department, and Patrick Newton, our administrative assistant. To begin then, let me share a little known fact about Lindsey. She quite literally became the person she is today while a student at IWU. Until approximately the age of 20, she erroneously spelled her first name with an A. And it was while she was a student here that she made the amazing discovery that her true legal name was Lindsey. If you know Lindsey, you can imagine her asking, "How could I not have known that?" More seriously, Lindsey embodies the qualities that we prize most in our students and that we prize most in an Illinois Wesleyan education. Today we showcase our first year experience, but IWU faculty have always been transforming the lives of their first year students. For Lindsey, that transformative experience was taking my course on the Enlightenment as a freshman 18 years ago. She traces her interest in history to that experience, though if truth be told, her interest in history surely went back further, as she herself has said, to the hours she spent examining the dusty artifacts in her grandmother's attic. Likewise, today we speak of scaffolding and bridge experiences between our students' freshman and senior years. But again, our students have always traveled along such paths. For Lindsey, that bridge was the junior year that she spent studying at the University of Oxford. There she became especially interested in the history of science and medicine and determined to return to Oxford one day to continue that study. Finally, we speak today of a signature experience, a culminating project undertaken in a student's final year. But the history department has been engaging our seniors in such capstone experiences for over 50 years. For Lindsey, that penultimate exercise was an honors thesis. The title of her thesis was, quote, "Magic, Mysticism, and Medicine, the Influence of Alchemy on 17th Century England." Aided by a $5,000 scholarship awarded through our chapter of Phi Kappa Phi, Lindsey followed her dream to return to Oxford to further study the history of science and medicine. She was one of only 7 students accepted into that program in 2004, and she subsequently received her doctorate from Oxford in 2009. Lindsey next received a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship through the Wellcome Trust and was affiliated with Queen Mary University in London. At that point, Lindsey was firmly set along the path or rut that most academics take toward a tenure-track faculty position. But Lindsey had other ideas. Here Lindsey began to display another quality that we very much prize these days, entrepreneurship, combined in her case with a native talent, imagination, or creativity that I don't think any teacher or institution can take credit for. She began to blaze her own trail, reaching out beyond the narrow confines of academia, cultivating a wider and more diverse audience. She started a blog called The Surgeon's Apprentice, devoted to gory, gruesome, shocking, and macabre episodes in the history of medicine. That blog soon attracted 70,000 subscribers and accumulated over 1.5 million hits. Those numbers are triple that these days. In 2012, that blog won an award from the American Historical Association as the best history blog of the year. Meanwhile, Lindsey made a pilot for a TV series on the history of medicine. She created a YouTube series called Under the Knife. She spoke at all kinds of venues throughout England and the United States about the history of medicine. She made TV appearances on PBS, the BBC, and National Geographic. She attracted a large following through social media, and she wrote freelance articles on a variety of subjects ranging from the history of sex toys in Penthouse magazine to more serious matters like serial killers in articles for The Guardian, The Huffington Post, History Today, and The Lancet. That's quite a range from Penthouse to The Lancet. These enterprises were not all rip-roaring successes. Lindsey had her share of disappointment and detractors. The TV pilot went nowhere. Readers criticized her articles. Academics saw her efforts as too dumbed down and popular. Lindsey had a lot of irons in the fire, so to speak, but all of them could still have gone cold. She had some small-time successes, but she hadn't yet broken through to the big time. There, by the way, is another of our current emphases at IWU. We exhort our students to be breakthrough. That's our new motto. All of Lindsey's efforts up to this point might still in the end have amounted to nothing if she had not created her own breakthrough moment. And then, at one of the lowest points in her life, when her husband deserted her on their 5th wedding anniversary,
you guys didn't know you were getting out.
when she had to worry about finding enough money to pay for groceries, when she faced possible deportation from England, there in the darkest moment, she summoned the courage and the talent to be breakthrough. And by damn, she did it. She proposed to write a book about Joseph Lister. She signed a contract for a 6-figure advance, and she sat down and wrote in a mere 12 months what is now an award-winning book. Lindsey is here tonight as part of the U.S. tour to promote the publication of the paperback edition of her book on Lister called The Butchering Art, and she will happily autograph copies for anyone who cares to purchase one after her presentation. Thad Sutter, our bookstore manager, is available over there to sell you those copies. I'm astounded to find out that they're only $16 and you get them signed. Yes. So now, everyone, please join me in welcoming back to our campus a 2004 graduate of Illinois Wesleyan University and the 2018 winner of the Penn Prize for Literary Science, Dr. Lindsey, spelled with an E, Fitzharris.
You know, it's kind of my fault. I joked to Dr. Young that I had done an event recently, and they said, "Here's Lindsey Fitzharris." That's all they said. So no one knew who the hell I was when I went out there on stage. But thank you. This man taught me everything I know. I am so excited to be here tonight to talk to you about the brutal and bloody world of Victorian surgery. I am currently going all over the world, and I am demolishing any lingering romantic notions people might have about what it was like to live in the past. Because if you come away from today's talk thinking it might have been nice to live in the 19th century, then quite frankly, I have not done a very good job. Because we are so lucky to live in the 21st century, lucky not to have to endure the horrors of pre-anesthetic and pre-antiseptic operations, like poor 12-year-old Henry Pace, who was told in the 1820s that he was going to have a leg removed without any anesthetic. When he was told this, he asked the surgeon whether it would hurt, and the surgeon replied, "No more than having a tooth pulled." Poor Henry Pace. He was brought into the operating theater, he was blindfolded and restrained, and he was so awake, so aware, he remembers counting 6 strokes of the saw before his little leg fell off into the hands of the surgeon. We are so lucky not to have to endure the horrors of pre-anesthetic surgery like poor Stephen Pollard. By the way, the slides get worse from here. One of the warnings Dr. Young should have said is that I've had 4 people, men, faint during my talks, so you've been warned. Stephen Pollard had to have a bladder stone removed in 1828. Now, if you don't know how this was done in the past, rest easy. I'm not going to go into detail right here. Suffice to say, there is plenty in the butchering art. I never know whether that is a deterrent or an incentive. But needless to say, you can tell two really important things from this image. Number one, it hurt a lot. And number two, it was really, really embarrassing. Because imagine being brought into an operating theater filled to the rafters with ticketed spectators and having your bladder stone removed, and you're fully awake. Now that's exactly what happened to Stephen Pollard in 1828, and what should have taken 5 minutes ended up taking over an hour, as he struggled against the knife and he cried out for the surgeon to please, dear God, stop. And the surgeon yelled back at him for having abnormal anatomy. Now, Stephen Pollard pulled through that operation only to die 24 hours later of post-operative infection, something that I talk about a lot in the butchering art, and I will talk about a lot tonight. And it was revealed on his autopsy report that, in fact, he did not have abnormal anatomy. It was the surgeon's fault. And let us not forget poor Lucy Thurston, who in the 1840s had to have a mastectomy without any anesthetic. Now, at this time, hospitals were very much places for the poor. If you were wealthy or if you were middle class, you had your operation in your home, like Lucy Thurston. The surgeon decided that the breast had to come off, and he told her he was going to show up, but he wasn't going to tell her the date. He didn't want her to focus on that. That would make me more nervous. You never know when this guy is going to show up. Show up he did. He walked through the door, up the stairs, into her bedroom. He opened his hand and showed her the knife he was going to use, and he told her to prepare her soul for death. That's not very confidence-inspiring when your surgeon tells you to prepare your soul for death. Prepare she did, but she could not prepare for the pain. Now, one of the problems that I face as a medical historian dealing with 19th century records is I don't often get patient voices. I get the voices of doctors in their casebooks, medical practitioners, but not always those patients. But tonight, we have Lucy Thurston's voice because she pulled through that operation. She actually went on to live a happy and healthy life, and she wrote to her daughter shortly after, and I want to share her words with you. She said, "Then came a gash, long and deep, first on one side of my breast, then on the other. Deep sickness seized me and deprived me of my breakfast. This was followed by extreme faintness. My sufferings were no longer local. There was a general feeling of agony throughout the whole system. I felt every inch of me as though my flesh was failing. I myself fully intended to have seen the thing done, but on recollection, every glimpse I happened to have was the doctor's right hand completely covered with blood up to the very wrist. He afterwards told me that at one time the blood from an artery flew into his eyes so he couldn't even see. So just when you think it couldn't get worse, he's blinded. And she said that it was an hour and a half that she was under his hand while he cut away at her breast without any anesthetic. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very lucky to live in the 21st century. We owe a huge debt to the medical practitioners who came before us, and of course the patients who endured these operations and taught them so much. Now, my book came out last year in hardback on October 17th, and I started a worldwide tour in Philadelphia. And I was really excited to start there because my book is about this man named Joseph Lister. He's a British surgeon, and he is now known today as the father of antiseptic surgery. He took Louis Pasteur's germ theory and he applied it to medical practice through the development of antisepsis. And of course, he saved thousands of lives in his own time, and he continues to save people's lives today because we know that germs exist. But I was excited to start in Philadelphia last October 17th because it was nearly 135 years ago to the day that Joseph Lister also went to Philadelphia. He went there to convince American surgeons of the existence of germs and of the need to adopt antisepsis. And a few fun things happened as a result of that trip. Now, if you're sitting here and you're thinking, the name Joseph Lister sounds familiar, but I'm not quite sure why, it's probably because of this product, Listerine. There was a man in the audience that day, and he was inspired. Maybe someone will be inspired here. And he created this product called Listerine. So it was named for Lister, but not by him, and it wasn't even used in the 19th century as a mouthwash. It was used more commonly to treat gonorrhea. Something that I'm pretty sure the Listerine company is not happy on going around telling. Nor do I endorse just throwing a little Listerine on it. There was another man in the audience, his name was Robert Wood Johnson, and he too was inspired by Joseph Lister. He got together with his brothers, and together they started to produce the first surgical antiseptic dressings in America. That company today is known as Johnson & Johnson. Now this pamphlet here, Johnson & Johnson produced at the end of the 19th, sort of early 20th century, and it's kind of like an idiot's guide on how to operate on your own kitchen table, and it's all perfectly safe as long as you use Johnson & Johnson surgical antiseptic dressings. So all of those wonderful things happened as a result of Lister going to Philadelphia. And of course, he was on a quest. He was on a mission to save people's lives. And I, too, am on a mission, not just to sell books, although you know where to buy them. My mission really is that the name Joseph Lister is just as familiar to people as the names Charles Darwin and Sir Isaac Newton, because I think his work is that important. But in order to convince you of that importance, I need to take you back to the early Victorian hospitals before Lister walks onto the scene. Now, these places were, the best that could be said about them was that they were a slight improvement over their 18th century predecessors, which wasn't really saying much when you consider in the 18th century, the bug catcher was paid more than the doctors and the surgeons. So this delightful trade card is from the 18th century. It's for a man named Andrew Cook. At the time that Andrew Cook made this, he called himself the Bug Destroyer. I think there needs to be a movie about this guy. And when he created this card, he claims to have rid 20,000 beds of lice. When you consider there was that much lice crawling around these hospitals, you can understand why Andrew Cook was paid so well. And it wasn't just that. In 1825, visitors to St. Thomas's Hospital remember finding mushrooms and wriggling maggots growing in the damp soiled sheets of a patient with a compound fracture. And what was so crazy about that moment was that the patient hadn't even thought to complain. These were the conditions that people had come to expect. Well, now that I've convinced you that if you miraculously had a time machine and you end up in the 19th century, you absolutely would not want to end up in these hospitals, it may come as a surprise to you that they were very difficult to get into. You needed this, a hospital ticket. This is from 1836. Now, in order to get a hospital ticket, you needed to petition hospital governors or someone on the hospital board. These people had no medical training, they were political positions, and it could take weeks, sometimes longer, before you got your hospital ticket, of course, during which time you could die. And although I said at the top of this talk that these places were for the poor, they were for what historians call the deserving poor. What does that mean? That meant that you still had to have a level of income in order to cover your room and board. So for instance, some hospitals charged you if they deemed you to be particularly foul. I don't know how they determined that. Everybody was particularly foul back then. Other hospitals charged you for your inevitable burial. It was so expected that you were going to die in these places. If you were absolutely destitute, you had no medical options in this period. So it's good to see that things have changed. Hashtag politics. I never know how an audience is going to react when I say that. But needless to say, you needed that admission ticket. Now, unsurprisingly, these hospitals were grimy and filthy and overcrowded, and all kinds of infections broke out in them, and this term is coined. It's called hospitalism. And it refers to this idea that you were more likely to die as a result of being in these hospitals than not. And there were 4 infections that surgeons particularly feared, and they were erysipelas, septicemia, pyemia, and hospital gangrene. Now, I always like to pause here and remind people that we still contract these infections and diseases today. We still die from them. But the difference is that because we understand germs exist, we are better able to proactively prevent it from happening. And of course, we are better able to treat it when it happens. If you don't understand how diseases are spread, this is a very deadly situation. And of course, they spread like wildfire around the hospital wards. These places became virtual pest houses. The Scottish surgeon John Bell wrote about the horror of hospital gangrene. He said, "The cries of the sufferers are the same in the night as in the daytime. They are exhausted in the course of a week and die, or if they survive and the ulcers continue to eat down and disjoin the muscles, the great vessels are at last exposed and eroded and they bleed to death." This was the conditions, this was the fate of many patients. Now, when I give my talks, I kind of read my audience, and I take things out or put things in. Nobody looks too horrified right now. I see you, you're smiling, you're like, bring it on. Okay, so one of the worst records I came across about hospital gangrene was, it comes from a naval record. It actually didn't come from a hospital record, but these naval ships in the early 19th century had very similar hygienic conditions. And I want to share with you, you're going to be really happy I don't have a slide for this in a second. So on the HMS Saturn, a malignant ulcer appeared on the tip of a seaman's penis. See, I told you. You're going to be happy. No illustration for this one. After several days of agonizing pain, during which the wound blackened and festered, the organ finally fell off. The guy is still awake, he's alive, his penis has just fallen off. The surgeon on board reported that the whole length of the urethra to the bulb slowed away, and also the scrotum, leaving the testes and spermatic vessels barely covered with cellular substance. And what was so crazy about this historical record is that the surgeon, bless him, felt the need to put at the end, he died. Of course he died. Someone should have killed him before it had gotten to that point. So this is the situation that surgeons and patients were facing. It was awful. It was an awful, awful time. In fact, when Joseph Lister entered medical school in the 1840s, the hospitals had become such pest houses that it was seriously suggested that the only way to control that situation was to burn the hospitals down from time to time and start anew. And I love the imagery of burning these hospitals down from time to time. Now, at this stage in the talk, I like to pause and I like to do a reading from my book. And I do that because, for a couple reasons. Number one, if you haven't read The Butchering Art and you don't know my style, I want to share that with you. I write narrative nonfiction. That means it reads like a novel, but it's 100% true. And I very much believe that history should be both educational and entertaining. And I find that the public really respond to this kind of style. The section I want to read you is about the first time that Joseph Lister entered the dead house, or what we might call the cadaver lab or the dissection room. And there are undoubtedly people who are pre-med or have gone through med school, your doctors, your nurses, you've had that experience, you've gone into the cadaver lab, you've watched CSI, you know what that room looks like, whatever it is, hold that image in your head. Because obviously what Lister was experiencing was very, very different. The bodies that he dissected were in semi-advanced states of decomposition because they couldn't be preserved. And also going into med school could be very dangerous. Because again, gloves, things like that weren't worn, nobody understood germs, this is before mass vaccinations, it's certainly before antibiotics. So a lot of medical students actually die as a result of going into their profession. So I want you to keep that all in your head. I do have visuals as I'm reading. If you're one of those people that kind of goes into a catatonic state, you can keep looking behind. It's about a 6 to 7 minute reading, and I hope you enjoy it. And afterwards, I'm going to get back to sort of horrifying you about the Victorian medical world. A halo of light from a gas lamp illuminated the corpse lying at the back of the table. The body had already been mutilated beyond recognition, its abdomen hacked away by the knives of eager students who afterwards carelessly tossed the decomposing organs back into the gory cavity. The top of the cadaver's skull had been removed and was now sitting on the stool next to its deceased owner. The brain had begun to degrade into a great pace days before. Early in Lister's medical studies, he came face to face with a similar scene at University College London. A central walkway split the dissection room in half with 5 wooden tables on either side. Cadavers were left with their incised heads hanging over the edges, which caused blood to gather in congealed puddles below. A thick layer of sawdust covered the floor, making the dead house disconcertingly quiet to those who entered it. Quote, "Not a sound could be heard, even of my own feet. There was only that dull and rolling sound of the traffic in the streets, which is peculiar to London, and which came dismally down through the ventilators of the roof," a fellow student observed. Although UCL and its hospital were still relatively new in 1847, its dissection room was just as grim as those found in older institutions. It harbored all kinds of horrible sights, sounds, and smells. When Lister sliced into the abdomen of a cadaver, its recesses turgid with the thick soup of undigested food and fecal matter, he released a powerful mixture of fetid smells that would cleave to the inside of his nostrils for a considerable time. To make matters worse, there was an open fireplace at the end of the room, making it unbearably stuffy during the winter months when anatomy lessons commenced because, of course, anatomy was a winter sport. That's when the bodies kept best. I gotta skip to the next one. Unlike today, students could not escape the dead during their studies and often lived side by side with the bodies they dissected. Even those who did not live immediately adjacent to an anatomy school carried with them reminders of their gruesome activities, because neither gloves nor other forms of protective gear were worn inside the dissection room. Indeed, it was not uncommon to see a medical student with shreds of flesh, gut, and brains stuck to his clothing after his lessons were over. The cadaver tested the courage and composure of anyone who dared set foot inside the dead house. Even the most seasoned dissectors could find themselves in pulse-quickening situations from time to time. James Marion Sims, a gynecological surgeon, recalled a terrifying incident from his student days. His instructor was performing a dissection by candlelight one evening when he accidentally knocked loose a chain that was wrapped around the corpse and anchored to the ceiling above the upper end of the table. The cadaver, pulled by the weight of its own limbs, jerked to the floor in the upright posture, with its arms forcibly thrown over the dissector's shoulders. Just then, the candle that had been resting on the dead man's chest sputtered out, leaving the room in total darkness. It was a hard time back then. For the uninitiated, the dissection room could be a waking nightmare. The French composer and former medical student Hector Berlioz jumped out of the window and ran home, later recalling it was as though, quote, death himself and all his grisly band were hot on my heels. He described an overwhelming feeling of the revulsion at the sights of the, quote, limbs scattered about, the heads smirking, the skulls gaping, and the bloody cesspool underfoot. One of the worst sights, he thought, was the rats nibbling on the bleeding vertebrae and the swarms of sparrows pecking at the leftover scraps of spongy lung tissue. And something I didn't add in there was that Berlioz becomes so used to it that he actually starts picking pieces of the body off and feeding it to the poor, hungry animals in the room. But clearly the profession wasn't for everyone. For those wishing to continue with their degrees, there was no avoiding it. Far from viewing it as repulsive, most students ultimately embraced the opportunity to carve up the dead, and of course Lister was no exception. Little by little, students began to view bodies set before them not as people, but as objects, as they do indeed today. This ability to divorce oneself emotionally came to characterize the mindset of the medical community. In the Pickwick Papers, Charles Dickens describes a fictional but entirely credible conversation between two medical students on a frosty Christmas morning. "Have you finished the leg yet?" asked Benjamin Allen. "Nearly," his colleague Bob Sawyer replies. "It's a very muscular one for a child. Nothing like dissecting to give one an appetite." As medical students became desensitized, they also became irreverent, much to the public's horror. Now, there's a great book by a man named James Edmondson, and he collected these sort of 19th century dissection photos, and they kind of range from the very serious posing with your cadaver to what you see before you hear. One of my particular favorites, and if you have come tonight because you follow me on Instagram, you will have seen it recently, the student's dream, where it's a student on the dissection table and he is surrounded by all these cadavers that he has dissected, which are now going to dissect him. Pranks in the dead house were so common that by the time Lister entered medical school, they had become a mark of the profession. Harper's New Monthly magazine condemned the jet black humor and indifference towards the dead that pervaded the dissection room. Some students completely overstepped the bounds of decency and used the rotting body parts of their allotted cadavers as weapons, fighting mock duels with the severed arms and legs. But it wasn't all frivolity. Cutting open dead bodies carried with it many physical risks, some of which were fatal. William Tennant Gardner, a professor at the University of Glasgow, addressed an incoming class with this dire message: "Not a single session has passed over our heads since I was appointed to my office amongst you that has not paid its tax of life to the great reaper, whose harvest is always ready, whose sickle is never weary." Jacob Bigelow, professor of surgery at Harvard University, also warned future medical students about the poisonous effects of a slight wound or crack in the skin made by the dissecting knife. These so-called pinprick cuts were a fast way to an early grave. The dangers were always present, even for the most experienced anatomists. Death was often inescapable for those trying their hardest to prevent it. The living in the form of disease patients were also taking a toll on those on the front line of medicine. Mortality rates amongst medical students and young doctors were high. Between 1843 and 1859, 41 young men died after contracting fatal infections at St. Bartholomew's Hospital before ever qualifying as doctors. Those who succumbed in this matter were often eulogized as martyrs who had made the ultimate sacrifice in order to advance anatomical knowledge. Even those who survived often suffered some sort of illness during their hospital residencies. Indeed, the challenges were so great for those entering the profession that the surgeon John Abernathy frequently concluded his lectures by uttering bleakly, "God help you all, what will become of you?" So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of what you can find in the butchering art if you haven't read it yet, and if that kind of appeals to you. There's a lot of stories about the atmospheres. The book is not just about Lister, it's about the period, and it's about how he navigates this world. Now, if you made it through medical school and you survived that experience, this became the center of your world. This is an operating theater. This is this fantastic image from the Burns archive, and it really underlines the theatrical aspect of what these operating theaters were like. These places were filled to the rafters with ticketed spectators. People actually bought tickets to come to the operating theater. And of course, they carried with them the grime and dirt of everyday life. These places were not at all sterile or hygienic in the way that we understand them. To give you an idea of what it was like, the surgeon John Flint South described it like getting a seat for a pit in a gallery of a playhouse. People were packed like herrings in a basket, and they shuffled with each other, and they shouted heads, heads whenever their view was blocked. And sometimes the operating floor was so crowded, it had to be cleared before an operation could commence. And you see this happening here. There's just guys sitting there. They might not even be doctors or surgeons. They might just be VIPs who have come to the operating theater to see this. And keep in mind that Joseph Lister is entering medical school in the 1840s, so these pictures are later. So this is actually an improvement to what he would have been experiencing. Surgery was a filthy business fraught with hidden dangers. I love this image. It's actually a butcher. It's not a surgeon, but it gives you an idea of what your friendly Victorian surgeon would have been wearing, which most importantly was that apron. And it would have been blood splattered, and he wouldn't have cleaned it. In fact, you would want your surgeon to have a very bloody apron because that showed he was experienced. And it was kind of a thing of pride. He never washed his hands or his instruments. He carried with them a cadaverous smell of rotting flesh, which they called good old hospital stink. So these places not only looked different to how we operate today, they smelled different. It would have been very terrifying as a patient to go into these places. Now, for the last part of this talk, I want to tell you about three men who I call the last butchers. Actually, I call them the last butchers of Gower Street, which is where they were performing and training in their operations. I think it's a great title. It's like, sounds like a novel, but people would probably think it's about serial killers. But I want to tell you about the last butchers of Gower Street. Now, these guys wouldn't have called themselves butchers, but I call them that to underline the idea that they would have been training in a pre-anesthetic era when speed and strength were necessary. The first one is this guy named Robert Liston. Now, all three of these men play important roles in the butchering art and in Joseph Lister's life. When I was thinking about what I was going to write, I thought, I'm going to write my book about this guy. He's 6'2", he's incredibly tall for the Victorian period. He's very strong. He can hold you down with his left arm and take off your leg in under 30 seconds. And he's known as the fastest knife in the West End. Some of my favorite stories about Robert Liston, one time, for instance, he would move so fast as he was switching instruments, he would hold them in his mouth, these bloody instruments. And he was moving so fast that he took off his assistant's finger. And then as he was switching blades, he slashed the coat of a spectator. And it was said that the assistant died of gangrene, the patient died of postoperative infection, and the spectator died right then and there of fright. So it is jokingly referred to as the only operation with a 300% mortality rate. So I thought, Robert Liston is my guy, you know. And another great story about him was he had a patient who was going to have a bladder stone removed. Now, we remember how awful that was from Stephen Pollard at the top. And this guy got onto the table and obviously looked at this 6'2" giant and decided he was not going to go through with this. So he jumps off the table, he runs across the room, he locks himself in the closet, and Robert Liston, all 6'2" of him, chases after him, rips the door off the closet, and drags this poor bastard back to the table, and he removes the stone. So he was a character, to say the least. Some people might be familiar with his name because he invented a knife which later became known as the Liston knife, which was used then by Jack the Ripper. And I thought, this is my guy. However, Robert Liston doesn't push the transformative moment that I ultimately wanted to tell. But Robert Liston does open the butchering art because he performs the first ever operation under ether in Britain in December of 1846. He doesn't discover it. It's brought from America, and he doesn't think it's going to work. He calls it the Yankee Dodge. And he walks into the operating theater as he would always do, and he would say, "Time me, gentlemen." And you can almost hear the ripple of pocket watches as they came out to time the great Robert Liston. And it worked. It was a miracle. The age of agony was over. Anesthesia had been discovered. Now, I start the story there because I think if anybody has ever thought about the history of medicine, which you may not have until you stumbled into this terrible, gruesome lecture. But if you have, you might have thought of that moment, the dawn of anesthesia. Certainly a huge moment in history. But actually, surgery becomes much more dangerous because the surgeon, unaware that germs exist, but no longer having to fight the patient, is more willing to pick up the knife. He is more willing to go deeper into the body. And as a result, post-operative infection rises, and these operations become nothing more than slow-moving executions. And I wanted to start there because on that day, in December 1846, first ever operation under ether in Britain, a 17-year-old Joseph Lister was in the audience. And I always joke that if I was writing the movie script, which I hope I'm going to be doing soon, I couldn't have written it better myself. So that is how this book starts. Robert Liston plays a huge role. Next guy I want to tell you about is this guy, James Syme. He is actually the cousin of Robert Liston, but he is very short and built very differently, and because of that, he is known as the Napoleon of surgery. He is also very fearless. If there is anybody in the audience today, in the medical profession, you're wondering why you know the name James Syme, it's because he invented a procedure that is still used today, a technique for amputating a diseased foot at the ankle joint. Now this is really important because until Syme comes along, if you come into the hospital with a diseased foot, you're gonna lose your leg right below the knee. And remember, these are very poor people coming to the hospital. They rely on their mobility for their livelihood. So losing a foot is a lot less tragic than losing half of your leg. Now, where Syme plays a huge role in the butchering art because he becomes Joseph Lister's father-in-law. And he re-inspires in Lister a passion for surgery after Lister has a mental breakdown and leaves medical school. Where his cousin, Robert Liston, was fearless, Syme was even more so. This guy comes to him in the 1820s. He has been suffering from a facial tumor for many years. Now, in this period, you get a lot of extreme examples because people, of course, they put off going to the surgeon, and you can't blame them. And we're kind of kidding ourselves if we don't think we put off going to the doctor anyway these days. But obviously, Mr. Penman has put it off for too long. It's obstructing his breathing. It is going to kill him. Now, he actually goes to see Robert Liston first because Robert Liston had just made a name for himself by removing a 45-pound scrotal tumor in under 4 minutes without anesthetic. Not 4 to 5 pounds, 45 pounds. So talk about I don't even know, like that to me, how do you let it get that? But like that seems insane. But Robert Liston does it, no anesthetic, boom, it's off. So Mr. Penman thinks that's my guy. But Robert Liston looks at this and he says, I'm not going to operate, which is tantamount to a death sentence from a surgeon like Liston. So Robert Penman travels up to Scotland, up to Edinburgh, where James Syme is, and James Syme does agree to do the operation. Now this is before anesthesia, this is in the 1820s, and for 24 minutes, Robert Penman is seated in a chair, because a lot of times patients weren't laid down before anesthesia, they were seated in really high chairs with their feet dangled so they couldn't push off against the knife, and he was restrained, and for 24 minutes, this was cut out of his face, piece by piece, as it was dropped at the bucket at their feet. And he survives. Now, later, I saw Syme had this like throwaway line in a journal, and it said that he had run into Penman much later in life, and he was delighted to see that he didn't bear any of the scars because it was hidden under this, what he called a luxuriant beard. I found a picture of him later in life, and I showed it to a friend of mine without any backstory. And she thought he looked really creepy. There was something very unsettling. He's kind of like a ugly Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln wasn't really known for his looks. But you know the story, and actually I think he looks pretty darn good for having gone through that. So Syme is in the story. He plays a significant role in Joseph Lister's life, and you will find him in the pages of the Butchering Art. The last guy I want to tell you about is this guy named John Erickson. He was one of Lister's instructors at University College London, and he is remembered by medical historians because in the 1840s he said that surgery would come no further and that the knife would go no deeper than it did at that moment. And we can't really fault him because he couldn't imagine a time when we could control pain, and he certainly couldn't imagine a time when we could control post-operative infection. But the story I want to tell you tonight is a story I tried to tell on an NPR interview. They had the foresight to pre-record me. Nobody likes to put me on live. And I told this story, and the interviewer loved it, but the producer was like, no way, you cannot say that on NPR. So you guys are my captive audience, so you get to hear this story. It really underlines just how far we have come in medicine. So Erickson is at the hospital, and Lister is attending as a student, and a woman is brought in, and she's asphyxiating on all this blood and pus in her throat. And Erickson cuts into her trachea, and all this blood and pus begins to spill out. And in an inspired moment, he puts his mouth onto this wound, and he begins sucking it out. That would have sold thousands of copies. Look at your faces. You're so delighted you came here tonight. And he does this 3 times, and she survives. He survives. Actually, for the purpose of my book, it would have been better if they both died to really illustrate how dangerous this was. But this certainly tells us how far we have come. Now, I'm coming to the end of this, and it may occur to you that I haven't actually told you much about Joseph Lister, who is right here, seated in the middle. I love this picture of him. And that is by design. But I will tell you just a little bit. He's a Quaker, and his religion guides him, and he gets a lot of pushback when he begins to advocate for germ theory and comes up with antisepsis. And it's hard for us to understand why. Why would people not believe this? Well, imagine there's this young guy, and he's coming along, and he's telling you that there are these invisible little creatures, and they exist, they're killing your patients. Trust me, I had this weird instrument called a microscope, which was very suspicious at this time in medicine, which I go into detail in the book. And the other part of that was that he was essentially telling the old guard that they had been inadvertently killing their patients all along. And I think that was a hard pill for them to swallow. What I want you to do, and maybe some of you have already done it tonight, but I want you to pick up the book and go on that journey with him. That's why I'm not going to tell you too much about how he did it. I want you to see how he navigates this grimy and filthy world and how he solves the greatest medical mystery of all time, saving more lives than anybody else who has ever lived. What I will tell you, what I want to leave you with is a sort of before and after shot. This is the US cover. So if you buy a copy tonight, this is the cover you will see. This is a very famous painting by a 19th century artist named Thomas Eakins. You can see this in Philadelphia. It's really big. And it's called the Gross Clinic, not because it's gross, although it's a little gross, but the man in the middle is Samuel Gross. And Samuel Gross was an American surgeon, and he so didn't believe in Lister. He so didn't believe in germs, he would walk into that operating theater, he'd slam the door, and he'd say, there, Mr. Lister's germs can't get in anymore. And you certainly see that playing out here. He's wearing his street clothes. This is a very dark and dingy scene. They're sticking their filthy fingers into that wound. There's a woman, and she's shielding her face. She is the mother of the patient, and she's wearing black because she expects her son to die. Now, inside the cover, but also on the British cover, we used another Eakins painting, which is this. I'm moving too far away. Okay. This is called the Agnew Clinic. Now, this was done within 10 years of the first one, and you can certainly see the before and after shot. Now, this has been stylized by Penniman, my publisher, but you can imagine it in its 19th century glory. This is a lighter, cleaner scene. You have a sense that these people understand germs. You have a sense that they might be using antisepsis. Women are appearing professionally in the operating theater. This is very different to the first painting. And I love that these covers are in conversation. And I also, I just love that before and after shot. The last thing I want to show you is I filmed a book trailer. Now, most authors don't do that, and if they do, it's just like them talking to camera. But I know some filmmakers in London, and we had access to an incredible space, which is one of the oldest operating theaters in London. It was really hard to get all that equipment up the stairs, because if these operating theaters exist, they're always in the attics of buildings, because they would have had the most natural light, so they're always difficult. You gotta really work to go see them. And we filmed this 5-minute video of a young Lister attending a pre-anesthetic operation and wondering why these patients keep dying. So I'm gonna leave you with that. I'm gonna play that in a second, and then I'd love to take your questions afterwards.
There you are. Aren't you coming?
He died.
Who?
The docker we were operating upon last night. He died half an hour ago.
Yeah, well, that ain't really unusual, Joseph.
No, that's the thing of it, isn't it? It's odd, don't you think? Given the body's remarkable inclination to heal itself, you don't think it's odd? Why, when we give it the opportunity, we take away disease, we afford it the chance to grow strong again, why do they die?
Trauma, Joseph.
No, not in so many. Too many are dying. These are strong men, James. Men who lead harder lives than you or I could tolerate. We operate on shipbuilders, labourers, farriers, the toughest breeds in the land. No. There's more to this than trauma. There has to be more to it than that. Something hidden from our understanding.
That's the supernatural then. Gods. Monsters. I don't know. Take your pick. Hey, we might have to burn the hospital down from time to time. Come on. I don't want to be late.
Monsters.
Liston! Come on. We knew we were in contact with genius. We felt we were helping in the making of history. And that all things were becoming new.
All right. Thank you. I was just out in LA and I was trying to get the movie made because I think it's just a brilliant story to tell. Fun fact, I'm stupidly in it at the end. You might have noticed. My friend who was filming is like, you have to be in it. I'm carrying all of Lister's published works. And we had imagined in our minds that we were going to have this great moment where Lister looks at me, the author, but that street was covered in cars. We had to digitally remove all of that. And we technically weren't allowed to film there, so we had to do everything with no sound, and all that had to be put in. The other thing was that we didn't have money to pay for the rights to music, so we had to compose our own music. So we called in every favor. Those guys are wearing wigs, which I think are pretty phenomenal. Our Lister was Canadian. I think he did a great job. And we auditioned those guys, but it was just an incredible fun. And ooh, sorry. And oh, dude, germs finally fell me. I'm really hoping to see that come to life. I'd love to take your questions. Come on, there must be some questions. Oh, and is there a microphone? Are we bringing it? Yes, great, perfect. This woman here has a question. Right here in the middle, yeah.
Did Lister do anything with puerperal fever, the post?
Yes, yeah. Are you asking about Semmelweis? Okay, so I'm looking at my friend Shelley. She's gonna laugh. So as I've been going around the world, I've noticed that I always get a question about this guy named Semmelweis. So if I'm preempting anybody's question, I'm sorry. I found that there's like a lot of groupies of this guy. So this guy Semmelweis in the 19th century was putting this idea together that if you washed your hands and you went onto the maternity wards, the mortality rates reduced, and that was about puerperal fever. And they kind of, a lot of people were like aggressively like, why aren't you talking about him? He's in the book. And he has a really sort of sad end because nobody believes him and they call him the hand washer. And he ends up in an insane asylum. And it's just this kind of very weird sort of romantic story about this doctor who wasn't believed. Lister was not aware of Semmelweis. And in fact, he went to visit the hospital many years later, and Semmelweis had already died. And they asked him, "Do you know of him?" "Oh, thank you. That's great. Is that gin? Is that nice gin and tonic there?" But he doesn't know of Semmelweis. The other difference is that there are people working in this period who are sort of putting together basic hygiene, working towards lower mortality rates, but they aren't yet putting together the idea of germs. And that's the really important factor, because until you understand germs, you can't systematically convince anybody to do anything. So for instance, Florence Nightingale, she actually doesn't believe Lister in germs at first. She thinks he's rather hysterical with his idea of germs. So it's a slow fight for him. But there are, all those people are sort of in the book, but I always say, Lister got the book for me because ultimately he is the one who convinces everyone. It is a love story between science and medicine. It is the first time that a scientific principle is applied to medical practice, and it is the birth of scientific surgery. But if I kind of tried to sell that up front, that would be like the nerdiest way to sell a book. It's a love story between science and medicine, but it really is the first instance of scientific surgery. Anybody else? Yes, back there. Oh, yep, they're handing microphones.
Hi, I'm a registered nurse and I teach in the School of Nursing here.
Okay, great.
I recently started reading your book and I'm about a third of the way through.
Okay.
So I really appreciated seeing what tourniquets look like in your photographs.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm really curious in doing your research, in your narrative, the descriptions are really more about the speed of the amputation and getting it over with.
Yes.
But as a clinician, I'm really curious whether you uncovered any detail of how these early surgeons tied off the arteries so that the patient didn't
I
bleed.
saw your hands going in that direction. I was like, this is what she's going towards. Yeah, I deal a little bit. You might get a little further on. Because as you know, when you chop off a leg, that's not the end of it, is it? And it's very bloody. And so when you think of Robert Liston being able to do this in under 30 seconds, is incredible. They have these little hooked instruments that pulled the arteries down and they tied them off. They didn't cauterize as much in the period that I'm looking at, although some surgeons still continue to do that. And that was really what was incredible, because when you take the leg off, there's so much blood and you have to work so quickly. And it was viewed, actually, when anesthesia was discovered, that it was dangerous because surgeons felt that the pain needed to be felt to keep the heart going, like the shock and adrenaline needed to work. And this also came from the fact that amputations were more survivable in the midst of war. When the surgeons were taking legs off in the midst of battle and the adrenaline's pumping, and they tend to have better results. But yeah, I don't go into huge detail. There's some fun stuff. You might have already gotten to it about these sort of pop-up shops in London selling painless knives. I love that. Come get your knives, they're painless, and which they were definitely not. And I like to say that if anybody's seen Gangs of New York, that's a very authentic sort of 1840s period. And in fact, even the clothing, like the plaids and the stripes and the crazy stovepipe hats, and they were really tall. It was very grungy and fashionable, and so it's before Victoria plunges everybody into mourning. And so Lister, as a Quaker, would have been wearing very plain clothes, very black and white. And as I'm talking about getting this movie done, I really want him to remain authentically Quaker, because I love this idea of him walking into this really hedonistic world. When ether is discovered, people have ether parties, they start drinking it and inhaling it. In fact, in London, you can still get ether cocktails. It's not illegal. it's highly flammable, so you don't really want to be. And these guys, they were smoking pipes and cigars, and so you get a lot of accidents with ether. But it is this sort of unregulated period. Cocaine, opiates, all these kinds of things. Some people might have seen The Nick. Anybody? Yeah, I see some heads. You know, and Clive Owen's character is very much like grappling with the demons of becoming a coke addict, and a lot of these doctors were testing these highly addictive drugs. But I always like to ask people, you know, before we judge the Victorians, think about what it is today, that in 50 to 100 years we might say, holy cow, like I can't believe doctors used to give out, and whatever that is, you know, we have an opioid crisis, and so, you know, we need to, you know, not make fun of them too much and kind of wonder about what it is today that people will think back. Any other questions? Yes?
Now, what influence, if any, did Lister have on Robert Koch and the development of postulates?
Okay, that's a really good question. He comes a little bit later. And actually, I stopped Lister's story. It's not a full biography. It stops sort of quite early once he comes to America, and I feel like he has triumphed in some kind of way. I don't keep retelling the story. He sort of moves from different cities, and it's more or less the same story. There was pushback. They hated him. He won. So later in his career, there would have certainly been communication and correspondence that would have probably been informing some of his later experiments. Actually, with Louis Pasteur, he was looking at Louis Pasteur's work, but never communicated with him because he didn't feel that he was intellectually up to par to communicate with this scientist. And Pasteur comes to London at one point, and someone says, hey, there's a surgeon, and he's saving lives because he's using your germ theory. And the way that he sort of puts it together is Louis Pasteur is working on spoiling wine vats. Like, that's really important. We don't want the wine to spoil. And it's taking on this particular smell. And and you saw in this trailer, he says the wound has soured. That was something that they would say. And it takes, you know, festering, you know, the nurse is nodding. It takes on a festering smell, doesn't it? And so he was wondering if the thing that was causing the wine to spoil might have also been causing the wound to spoil. And that's how he starts to put this together. And later, Louis Pasteur and Lister start to correspond. And one of the best moments, I think, is much later when they're older men. Lister goes to Paris to honor Pasteur. Pasteur has had his second stroke. He can't speak or stand. But Lister goes there, and he goes onto the stage. It's the first time they've met, and he honors him and says about Pasteur what Pasteur probably would have said about him. And it's this incredible moment, and it's captured in this beautiful painting, and it is really, truly science and medicine meeting on the world stage. And so when I was writing this book, I actually wanted to write Pasteur's story in parallel, but the publisher felt that Pasteur's story was too well known, and so it developed in a different direction. But it really is an incredible relationship those two men have. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I noticed on your British or the English cover,
Yes.
you had a woman. Could you give a little bit of a glimpse into what women were doing at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So nursing, until Florence Nightingale comes along and revolutionizes it, nursing is really seen as not a very nice profession to go into for women because they were privy to the male body. So it was almost like tantamount to going in, not quite prostitution, but it was seen as like a lowly job. So when Lister first enters the hospitals in Scotland, there's a lot of stories about these drunk nurses, and he had to, they would be laying in the bed, and it wasn't an organized profession, and it wasn't a respected profession. But later, as Lister's doing his work, Florence Nightingale, of course, is revolutionizing nursing as well. So you do begin to see women start to appear in hospitals. Also, I can't speak with huge authority, but I think that over here, the first women's medical college was in the 1870s. It's earlier than you think. And sometimes on my Instagram account, I'll post an image of women, and they're in their dresses, and they're dissecting bodies, and it's just incredible. And so there was a couple of sort of pop-up medical colleges where this was happening, but it wasn't a huge, obviously accepting. The other thing was that Joseph Lister, and I don't talk about this in my book, and a couple of critics have said she, ignored this kind of what they consider a nasty part of him. He didn't believe that women should go into medicine. Now, the reason I don't talk about it is I didn't think it was noteworthy. Of course, this white male Quaker from the Victorian period wasn't. If he was a huge advocate of women, that would have been weird and something I felt could have gone in the book. But he really didn't believe that women should be in medicine. He thought they were too fragile in their constitution. That said, his wife is a shadowy character that I wish I could have known more about, but again, there wasn't that much. But I get a real sense that she was a force behind him, and he was a mind that wouldn't stop, and she was always there recording his notebooks, helping behind the scenes. And so I think when I was out in LA talking about this, it would be great to bring, up those female characters and try to develop them a little bit more. But there isn't much to be said about it until sort of the later 19th century. Yes. Oh no, I'm a real historian asking a question. This is when it all goes to... Oh, yep.
They're elites in their field, and their motives are all, exactly what we'd expect. I'm wondering about, the rank and file butchers. I mean, how long does it take them to be trained to chop somebody up in?
Sure, yeah.
Some of them like closet Dexters,
Maybe that's a novel for me. No, it's a good question. At this time when Lister is starting, surgery is not as respected as being a physician. And that's very much because surgeons were men who worked with their hands. They were seen as craftsmen. And it's a hangover from the 18th century, early 19th century, when they're related to barbering. So barbers were people who didn't just trim your beard, they picked lice, they pulled teeth, and they performed minor surgical procedures. The most important thing they did was bloodlet. And so the barber's pole, which many of you might know, is red and white because the barber would advertise using this pole, and he would tie his bloody rags on it to advertise outside that he bloodlet, and these rags would twist around and create the barber pole. And this was the improved version of how they advertised, because in the medieval period in London, they used to just put bowls of congealed blood in their window. And London was just like, no, you gotta knock that off. And they just started throwing that blood in the Thames, which I'm not sure that was a great solution either. But the barbers and the surgeons are very connected. How many people know the demon barber Sweeney Todd, that story? Okay, so Sweeney Todd and Shelley, what was I talking about earlier? The Marriage of Figaro, or the Barber of Seville. Okay, so these are the two things that happen in these earlier periods, is that the surgeons start to fight the barbers, and they don't want to be associated with barbering. And so these rumors pop up, and one of them is that your barber is going to kill you and make you into a pie. And there's a lot of sort of cannibalistic stories that revolve. Sweeney Todd is one of those stories that pops up. Because if you think about it, barbering is pretty scary. It's like you're covered, and this guy takes a razor to your neck and starts shaving you. And there's a frightening aspect to that. You don't know who this guy is. And then the Barber of Seville, that was the other aspect. So it was like the sexually ambiguous barber who was getting involved in his patients' lives. And so these are two ways to sort of slander the barbers that the surgeons started. The surgeons and barbers eventually break off. And to get a degree, to go back to your original question, it depended. Medical education was really fragmented at the time. So, in London, it was a different experience to the countryside, different experience to Edinburgh. But in general, at the time Lister enters, it's becoming more uniform. Now they have to take exams. There's a more structured aspect to that. And surgery is becoming more respected, although it's still seen as kind of lowly compared to the physicians who use their minds to heal, not their hands. But yeah, it is a little confusing, and I can't speak to the American side of things, but it is very fragmented at the time. But it would take, Lister entered medical school at 17. It would probably have taken him around 4 years to qualify, and that's not different. So when you're in Britain today, you can enter medical school at 18. Which is crazy. There's really young surgeons. When I would go to the doctor, I would be like, oh my God, how is that guy qualified? He is so young. But that's because they don't have to do an undergrad degree. They can go right into it, which I'm not sure how I feel about that. The other thing is Lister would have been Mr. Lister for his life, and actually surgeons in the UK still do not take the doctor title, which is also a hangover from the idea that they were craftsmen. So when I had my appendix out in London, they told me that Mr. Smith was coming to do it. And I was like, whoa, who is this guy? He's like coming off the night shift and is just gonna remove my appendix. So it's a weird thing, and I still have that question. How do you distinguish a Mr. from a Mr. like a Mr. Doctor? It's like you just have to know he's a doctor, like I guess, or Ms. or Mrs. Like you just have to know. But yeah, fun fact for you. So, yes, question in the back.
I'm a little bit late for today, but was there much communication between Lister and Jon Snow?
Oh, that's a really good question. A lot of people don't ask about him. Jon Snow, there's a fantastic book called The Ghost Map, which is, you're nodding, you obviously, that's like in the genre of what I write, and it's about this guy, Jon Snow. I talk about him in the book. There's no communication, but Jon Snow is really important because there's a cholera epidemic in London, and he maps it to this one pump. And that's important because at this time, people think that disease is spread by miasma or bad smells. And so this kind of undermines that idea. And so there's a lot happening before Lister sort of understands germ theory. And this is important too because ideas aren't created in a vacuum. So there's a lot of people that Lister's reading and they're influencing. And he's in the book, but he's not like a huge part. But The Ghost Map is a fantastic book. And there's some other ones, The Knife Man by Wendy Moore, which is about an 18th century surgeon named John Hunter. And Catherine Arnold wrote a fantastic book recently called Pandemic, 1918, about the flu pandemic. So if this is like in your wheelhouse and you're looking for more, those are some great books to pick up. I get paid to say that by them. No, I'm just kidding. Any other questions? Or yeah, one more question. Yeah, let's do it.
I'm just curious about the etymology of the term infection. Was it used prior to Lister in the context of surgery?
I'm looking at my friend Shelley. I'm like, a question I have not gotten. That's great. Are you an Illinois Wesleyan student?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. I don't know. This is a terrible one to end on. However, I think it's really important that historians admit when they don't know something, right? Am I right? Up there, all the history professors. Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. I was telling someone earlier that the word patient, that this idea that God would suffer onto you a disease and that you should patiently just deal with it. And so in earlier periods, like in the 16th century, there's actually books that teach you how to die well. And so this idea that you were a patient, that you were patiently suffering. So that's the only, cocktail weird thing I can tell you that you can tell people. But I'm going to look into that. Thank you so much for that question. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I would love to sign your books, and I would love it if you'd support me. I'm a freelance writer, and I need the support. So thank you so much. I hope to see you over there.